though these are shaped, these have a long history. That history shapes, so in that sense, the vocabulary, the concepts, the constitutional structure are there. Now, I agree with you, and it's a really interesting thing to stress that to try to think about the different subject positions of a Martin and a Joan of Martina. Absolutely, that's very interesting.
Remember, later on, as you well know in 1391, Marti engineers conversions, and Joan allows priests to enter Jewish quarters to effect them.
Yeah.
I think they're both also playing in the moment. In other words, your argument for certain politics which will somehow mediate these ideas. I think here we see in 1391 the reality of people just tussling, trying to make it by. And
so
maybe not so theoretically.
This gets a little too, I think it was Zem's question too. Let me just put my cards on the table. I don't think there is such a thing as reality that isn't in some way shaped, inflected, apprehended, cognized, made sense of through categories we have. Mm-hmm. So there's no reality that floats entirely free of terms and history and concepts. And in that sense, I think these concepts matter. Do I think this was a dramatically new moment? Absolutely. But it's interesting how the first thing he turns to in this dramatically new moment is an existing vocabulary and an existing form of action and an existing logic, which he actually cannot carry out. And he's even when he knows he can't carry it out, that's when he's stuck. Then he doesn't know what to do. But it is his first impulse is to go back to Ambrose and Theodosius, church and state, all very well. But what Ambrose specifically says is that it's to place the emperor's law above God's law. So he himself places it as a struggle between two legal systems and two jurisdictions. And I think we tend to forget how embedded that concept was in the constitutional, I'm always using the word constitutional loosely, thought of the late. And you had your hand up, Rick.
I had a question. It's like after 1391, are there debates about this connection between violence, monarchy, and miracles? Because it comes to my mind, like in any type of discourse, like diatribes or other type of text. Because thinking about like for Galician Fide, the books on the Jews, the book actually finishes after, I don't know, like 180 folios, on basically the expulsions, the different expulsions that different kings made, like the expulsion in England, the expulsion in France, and the expulsions in the Iberian Peninsula, and how he makes Alfonso Espina makes a comment like how well it went to that king when he expels the Jews. Yeah. Then after that is a section of miracles. And after the section of miracles is basically the part of law and Jews and law. So I'm wondering if it was something that was debated after 1391, and was there a correlation?
So one of the sections I cut out of this for space and time has to do with precisely what other kings did. I understand other kings chose to exercise their power of decision by expelling their Jews, and what they tended to do was convert those expulsions into a tax. So the King of England got the largest medieval tax ever when he expelled his Jews. The King of Anjou does the same thing. He expels them, but in exchange he gets an annual tax on all his subjects. And they often get praised as great monarchs for doing this. So as a new Vespasian, or as a in terms of, or as a new holy king. That doesn't happen. So that's what you're referring to. And that's actually what Espina is deploying. He's trying to say to Spanish monarchs, look what all these other monarchs did. You're not doing it, but look what they all did, and that's why they're so holy. It doesn't. I don't see that after 1391, but in part it's because the monarchs didn't expel the Jews. Right? They didn't take the step necessary to anoint themselves as a new Vespasian. Or did I misunderstand your question?
No. It has to be, but also it was the fact that I think Espina in a certain way is pointing that, of course, the solution would be an expulsion to all of it. But also the fact that he's is the, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much, it's like the order that he's presenting the topics. I mean, you go to expulsion, then you go to miracles and other cruelties that the Jews have done and violence, and then you go to where does it, like, do the Jew fit in the law, per se. So I think I mean, of course he didn't want to tell the monarchs directly, which is pointing to the expulsion evidently, but I think like there's a correlation that he's making between
I have to go back.
expulsion,
Yeah.
miracles, and law.
I haven't thought, I mean, obviously that's a whole, several generations after this, but a very interesting text. I should go back and think about what you're suggesting, that its internal structure itself hints at a certain political, theological logic. And so I'll go back to that. It's a great suggestion.
I would like to go back to the question of constitutional issues and the theory of power that you were raising. And I would like to also talk a little bit about Iberian questions or Iberian events that are taking place in that sense and that are perhaps important. I don't know if they also become important in 1391 or not, but it would surprise me that they didn't. It's that a certain constitutional revolution has taken place in the Iberian Peninsula in two times. First in the late 13th century and then in 1348 when the partidas are enforced. So the partidas are enforced, and they are not just enforced as civil law, they are also enforced as ecclesiastical law. So the king is the one who promulgates both ecclesiastical and civil law, thus transforming completely the theory of power. And also, after 1348, something extremely important happens is that these partidas are immediately translated. After the promulgation by Alfonso XI, they are immediately translated in Portuguese and in Catalan. So in this event, in this crisis, this constitutional crisis that the King of Aragon is suffering, does he, and you are saying that he is invoking legal language and that they are negotiating legal language between the municipal corporation and the king. What is actually the legal sources of that they are invoking? And is there any reference to this revolution in the theory of power that is the partidas? That I think it is so important to understand also the collision of politics and theology.
Well, I suspect this says a lot more about my ignorance than about anything else, although it might also owe a lot to the fact that very few scholars of Catalan medieval law would really be happy to grant that the Siete Partidas had a huge impact on Catalan legal thought. That I don't know of any effect or citation of the Siete Partidas in the material I look at. But then I haven't thought about it. It's actually a really interesting question. From my sense was the legal revolution that really mattered here was the Roman law revolution that basically James I had begun, and that every succeeding Catalan king had tried to push forward. But I hadn't thought about it in terms of the Siete Partidas. But now I will.
But they translated the partidas in Catalan. We have
I'm not saying they didn't. I'm just saying I don't know of any.
And that's it's Roman law as well.
Of course.
But it is discussed already. So
Absolutely. I just don't know where. I know a couple of people I might ask about that. If you know of anything in where any place in which the Siete Partidas, especially Book 7, or get into.
And the first one.
Yeah.
The first and second partidas. In the second partida, we still have the first partida. We only have fragments, but the second partida, no, we have it we have, I think, a full version of it.
Yeah, it's another project. I'm signing up for it. Well, I just want to say thank you to the vice chair.
So before we head off to the food and drink, does anybody have any final comments, questions, summations, sarcastic remarks? People are tired of that conversation. So let's head to the reception.
Maybe after some break.
Yeah.